Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 229 and I am the show's host, Kyle. I got a lot of news I want to get through today. There's a lot going on in the world, especially geopolitically. Not all just what the U.S. is doing, but certainly a lot of things worth covering. North Korea, Syria, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela being some big news stories from over the weekend. So for those of you who could take the time to share the show, I do really appreciate it, and it really does make a difference in getting the show out there to new listeners. So the best places to do that are on foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or by going to libertarianinstitute.org and finding the show there at the homepage. So we'll start with North Korean news. So, if you just watch the mainstream media, you might not have the same impression of the North Korean kind of peace process as I do. Certainly from everything I read, it does seem that, especially within the region, East Asia and the Pacific there, things certainly seem to be going well. Now, whenever things venture into the realm of talks with the United States, it gets a little bit more shaky, but we continue to get news like the North and South Korean generals meeting, talking about reducing tensions, possibly taking some artillery positions away from the DMZ. This would be a significant step and very important for the South Koreans. For those of you who are longtime listeners of the show, going back to the early episodes, one of the things I readily talked about was North Korea possessed a deterrent aside from nuclear weapons, really against attack or invasion, and that was their massive artillery positions just north of the DMZ, putting a lot of very large cannons well within the range of Seoul and the metropolitan area surrounding the people that has, I think, 30 million people or so in it. So, this is a big target that North Korea had even without the nuclear weapons. Now, a nuclear weapon with an intermediate range or a long, intercontinental ballistic missile then puts more U.S. targets to the base at Okinawa, Taiwan, Japan, Guam, the United States, Hawaii, all within, reach of a North Korean nuclear weapon. However, any attack on North Korea, even prior to them establishing they had the nuclear weapons and a hydrogen bomb with a, intercontinental ballistic missile was certainly there in their ability to shell Seoul. So North Korea is starting to walk back on some of these positions. I think is probably a big step for these two countries and definitely shows relations are going in the right direction. Something else that I see as a pretty positive indicator is you have Japan removing some Patriot missile batteries, citing that there's less of a concern to be attacked by North Korea. And so, here we have a country, two countries in the region, two of North Korea's closest neighbors, South Korea and Japan, that are allied with the United States, and both of these countries have, tens of thousands of U.S. troops within them, and, I think Japan and Okinawa is still home to U.S. aircraft carriers, so there's a lot of significant targets in this region. Why, Japan and South Korea would assume that, they would be targeted if war broke out between the United States and North Korea. However, they're taking steps that say we're no longer, or we're much less concerned about the North Korean threat. And so from that situation, from that perspective, it does seem like the Korean peace is going well, whether or not that means it's led by the United States. That portion of it isn't going quite so well. But as far as what's actually happening on the ground in the region, steps in the right direction. Now, you have a lot of thoughts, and I think this is mostly played up in the United States media, that anything North Korea is doing that is not directly in line with the media's conception of what peace and what North Korean denuclearization should look out is highly sensationalized and very much pointed to. Now, some of this could be very important, right? If the North Koreans are trying to do an end run around the agreement and somehow trick Donald Trump into removing U.S. defenses so he could launch a preemptive attack, well, that would be something the media should talk about. But, anybody who looks at the situation with any amount of reality, knows that that's really not the case. And North Korea's, nuclear weapons and even most of their just conventional military are more deterrent forces. And, they don't seem to be looking to invade South Korea or would even have the capability to as far as conventional weapons go. Now, in somewhat positive news from the Trump-Kim side, we do have Kim Jong-un sending a letter directly to Donald Trump and Donald Trump sending something in response. Now, this seems like an odd way for the two leaders to communicate on the surface level, but I guess if either leader, in, North Korea, Kim Jong-un sending the letter first, maybe he thinks that either somebody within his government is going to misrepresent his words or somebody within the U.S. government will misrepresent his words, conveying them to Donald Trump. And so it seems like this letter could be a, good, secure way of communication. And also, I don't know this, but it may have, more ceremonial purposes for the North Korean people. So, again, I know that, you tune into not Fox News as much, but CNN and MSNBC, and anything you see on the North Korea situation is certainly negative. However, I don't think we have to be pessimistic about this. And I think the talks and the peace process tend to be tracking in the right direction, in spite of everybody's attempt to really screw that up. Another story I want to talk about involving Japan was the U.S. base at Okinawa. Now, the U.S. has a lot of bases on Okinawa, I should say, the island there, which is south of Japan by some miles, but we station an aircraft carrier there, and I'm sure they see it as a very strategic point and base. But U.S. bases cover like 20% of that island. That's very populated, so with such a heavy U.S. military presence, there's going to be some tensions between the U.S. military and the population of Okinawa. But something that I just read that should really be shocking and should cause the United States to really start to look at, what a seemingly innocuous U.S. base is actually having an effect on the population there. And that is there's Japanese schools that are forced to evacuate 670 times already in 2018. So that's not even a whole year's tally or anything like that. Basically what happens is for whatever reason, I've never flown a bunch of helicopters before, but the helicopters had things fall off them quite a bit. One actually fell and hit a school like a 10 or 20 pound panel. And also like a full door has fallen off a helicopter. Now maybe this is something that happens that you really can't control. But it's certainly a danger for the population. And imagine if it's your child's school that, is getting removed from classes 3 times a day because a U.S. jet or a U.S. helicopter is going to fly over that school. It would certainly be something that you would think would enrage the local population. There is a pretty heavy movement and significant protest within the island. Of course, it never really gets covered. In the U.S. media whatsoever, but there is a significant protest movement against the U.S. occupation and bases in Okinawa. There's other issues related to, these are young U.S. Boys that are often deployed over there, and so not to make light of it, but there's a lot of drinking that goes on and consequences from that, and there's been some sexual assault and rape cases, and I can't point my finger at anyone right now and say, these 3 people are guilty of rape, but these kind of stories certainly inflame the local population and make them very upset that there's a foreign military presence on their land and it's screwing up their lives pretty heavily. I read a story in the American Conservative. I'm going to link to it in the show notes page, but I thought it was very interesting. The Pentagon has this other transaction authority, and this OTA is what it's called here. Basically will allow the Pentagon to just give a contract to a company without any authorization, approval, or oversight. And so this seems to should really be a problem because the Pentagon's already used like $21 billion within this program. But they could essentially just say, we're going to give you this amount of money to build this kind of thing. Congress is supposed to have authorization approval. That's what the NDAA is for. And so, this allows, I'm sure, for a lot of corruption, because then you don't even have these companies bidding on contracts. Not that that's really a way to stop all the corruption in the first place, but it does help if you have to, have open bidding processes. And so, the Pentagon's doing an end run around that. This is, just easy corruption. And these are the kind of things that go on in the government organizations that cause so much problems for the American people. And it's why we really can't just, sit back and let the Pentagon do whatever it wants and say, you don't support the troops if you don't approve of it, when really very little of this has to do with supporting the troops and, more about making sure the right people and the right organizations get paid. Now, in Venezuela, I think this was, I read about it on Saturday night, so I'm guessing relatively same time zone in the U.S. as Venezuela. You had what they're calling a drone attack on a public speech Maduro, the president of Venezuela, was giving. and that drone detonated and injured 7 people. As far as I'm aware, nobody actually died in the attack, and the Venezuelan government is saying that Maduro is fine. Now, obviously, the government of Venezuela is very corrupt and very powerful and holds probably a pretty tight grasp on news and information coming out of Venezuela. So it could be that, the official story isn't true. There's always the possibility of a false flag that will allow a leader to seize more power. However, it does look like there was some sort of an attack. You can see pictures of people being injured, and so I'm sure this is something that's going to be very important as the situation unfolds in Venezuela. The only other thing I was mentioning, as I'm reading some reporting from Yahoo and CNN on it, the media line is very anti-Venezuelan government. Now, I'm not going to make a defense of the Venezuelan government, because a lot of what they do is indefensible, and it's actually, hurt the own economy and the people of Venezuela. However, I don't think it's good journalism for them to just repeat lines like the Venezuelan government doesn't have much support for the people when they recently, Maduro won re-election and does seem to have a good bit of popular support from the people. And also never look at U.S. sanctions as a cause for the Venezuelan people struggling. When it's very interesting, because the sanctions are there to hurt the economy. That's why we put them in there, because when it hurts the economy, eventually the country is going to have to give in to the U.S. demands or do the right thing for their people, right? This was the line coming out in the 90s under Clinton with Saddam, and that is, we got to put the pressure on the people so they rise up and overthrow the leader. These are the points of the sanctions. And yet, then when the economy struggles, we always point to the leader of the country and see, oh, what terrible leaders they are. And a lot of times they are terrible leaders, but again, the fact that we never look at the U.S. sanctions as the reason that so many people are struggling, it seems to be just an amazing oversight. The other news coming out of Venezuela I thought was interesting is it looks like they're going to increase their regulation of cars. One of the things the Venezuelan government does is produce very cheap fuel for its people, and there's some rumors that price may be going up. They're doing like a census on cars, and I think the way the process works for registering your car, it's a lot easier to do if you're a supporter of the government. So, again, not to say that the Venezuelan government is good, because this is obviously a negative thing. They obviously suppress the opposition, but that doesn't mean every single person in Venezuela wants to overthrow the government, or even a majority. We had the elections in Zimbabwe. I think the voting actually took place last Wednesday when we had a winner declared late last week. The opposition did protest the election and say that the voting totals were wrong and invalid, and came up with a whole bunch of excuses. I don't know Venezuela internally well enough to know if that's true or not. It does look like the man who assumed power after Robert Mugabe was overthrown, and that is his former vice president and revolutionary compatriot, actually, Emerson Mnangagwa. And he is the new, I guess, kind of officially elected president now. So we'll see. The opposition protesting on Wednesday led to about 6 people being killed, and it looks like the military is coming into the capital city, Harare, there, and trying to kind of oppress the people quite a bit in order to kind of keep control. Anytime you have a change in leadership, I guess it is an opportunity for a country to move into a right and better direction. Zimbabwe wasn't a super prosperous country and doesn't seem to be a great country to live in under Robert Mugabe. And it seems that the new president, Emerson, is more looking like he just wants to be the new ruler in charge rather than a true reformist looking to better the lives of the people. Now, interestingly enough, of all the places in the world you're seeing some really significant peace processes going on, that's in the Horn of Africa. I've covered a little bit the kind of reestablishing of relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Eritrea has now reached out to the Somalis and to Djibouti to look to reestablish diplomatic relations with those countries. Somalia seems like it's going to be a difficult one just because Somalia has like 4 different controlling factions. You have the Al-Shabaab area, you have like the recognized central government, you have Puntland and Somaliland. And so for Eritrea to try to, I guess probably navigate the Somali politics to work something out may be kind of difficult, but Eritrea has long been one of the most repressed societies on the planet, and it does look like these steps towards peace may be easing some of the internal repression of the civilians. I read a story that the leadership of Eritrea announced that the indefinite military service that was imposed on at least all male citizens is not going to be indefinite anymore, and they're only going to do their kind of set amount of military civic duty. However, there is still a lot of poverty and instability in the Horn of Africa and in East Africa in general, and this has led to a lot of migrants and refugees, and some of these migrants and refugees continue to go to Yemen in search of a better life. I find this phenomenon very interesting just because Yemen has been in the middle of a now 3.5-year long civil war, and it seems interesting that I guess people haven't yet gotten the word that the situation in Yemen is probably just as bad and more likely worse than the situation that those people are coming from. So I'm trying to piece together how this could happen. Now, it could just be a lack of information. Access to technology isn't, like what it is in the United States. And people can't just, go on Google with their LTE and 4G and whatnot and get good access to all the information of what's going on in Yemen. However, you would think that, somebody would have access and be able to say, well, Yemen's the one place worse than here, so why are we going there? And possibly what incentive could be driving people to go to Yemen, even if they're aware of the civil war. Other stuff going on in Yemen, it looks like to some extent the offensive against Hodeidah has been restarted. I covered the bombings against the fish port there and then the hospital. I read on Moon of Alabama, so he usually has pretty good analysis saying that actually may not have been airstrikes, but shelling from long-range artillery bought by the Saudis from the UK. One of the things that would suggest is Saudi Arabia is going to once again be involved in this offensive, whereas the last time it was taking place in June, it seemed to be mostly UAE backed. Of course, the problem with the offensive against Hodeidah is it's going to lead to a lot of starvation in Yemen if the Saudis and the Emiratis are able to take the city from the Houthis. And even a significant fighting in the city that's going to slow or stop aid from coming in through the port and being able to leave the city of Hodeidah and get to the other areas of Yemen, particularly the mountainous areas controlled by the Houthis, then those people are going to start starving and dying. Now, it does look like the UN is making a real push to try to figure out some sort of solution here. The new envoy, Martin Griffith, is looking to hold peace talks between the warring parties in Geneva on, I believe, September 6th. So hopefully those peace talks turn out well. There was an episode of the Scott Horton Show where he had Nassar Arraybee back on, who's the great Yemeni journalist who has worked very hard to cover this war and make sure that at least some portion of the American people, the listeners of the Scott Horton Show, are informed of what's going on in Yemen. Very important stuff and numbers that he's able to give an analysis on the situation. So I will link to that interview in the show notes page for those of you who want to listen to it, but it's a lot of very good analysis, but I don't need to go over it right now. Syria news. Russia has sent a letter to the United States asking for the United States to cooperate with Russia in Syrian reconstruction. Again, this would be a great opportunity. I've talked about this before on the show for the United States and Russia to build ties. And even if it's not doing something extremely positive for Syria all the time, with some of the reconstruction projects, at the very least we're working together in Syria than working separately, which would more likely be effective. We could hope. Alright, so I'm gonna wrap up today's show talking about Afghanistan. We had another attack on a Shia mosque killing 39 suicide bomber who also gunned down some people first. Likely ISIS-K is behind this attack. They've been absolutely brutal in Afghanistan recently. Hopefully somebody could do something against them. The Taliban seem to have somewhat of an effective campaign against them in the northern region of Afghanistan. So maybe we could, start to see if tensions could be eased between the Afghan government and the Taliban, the United States and the Taliban, for these focuses to focus on a much worse evil, which is ISIS-K. We had 3 foreign aid workers kidnapped in the capital city of Kabul and then killed. I think the importance of this story is that the United States really seems to be unable in the Afghan government to secure the capital city of Kabul. And if you're looking to wage that war and you can't hold the capital city, then I'm not sure how they're going to do any of the nation building that they've been attempting to do for all of these years. again, it seems like the best policy is what it seems that, maybe the Trump policy is shifting to, and that is just to get out of Afghanistan at this point. All right, the last thing I'll mention is I know on the start of episode 228, I mentioned that there was a VIPS memo dealing with Russiagate saying that the Hillary Clinton emails were leaked and not hacked, and this was shown in the metadata of the leaks at the download speed. But then Bill Binney said that information may not be accurate. Now he is saying the article that I read indicating that was actually, his quote was taken out of context. So I'm not sure where I stand on that. And it still seems though that this is a minor part of the Russiagate narrative. And overall, when you look at the story, there's absolutely no evidence that Trump colluded with the Russians to steal that election victory from Hillary Clinton. All right, thanks everybody for tuning in today. Foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com if you want to share the show. Libertarianinstitute.org is where you can find all of my work, including the daily news roundup. Immersionnews.com, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus if you want to help share the show, help the show to grow, donate to the show and all that good stuff. I got some bonus content I did with Pat McFarlane, host of the Liberty Weekly content, who's coming back after a little bit of a hiatus, and so you can check that out. It should be up in the next couple days. Thanks everyone.